Thank you for coming. My name is Professor Prof Dojs. I'm going to be giving your convocation this morning. I'm honored to be able to do that and to share a little bit about my research and some work that I've been doing over the last couple of years. Today's presentation is entitled to the Vanishing Point and Back. And just out of a show of hands, how many of you were able to come to my convocation last year? A number of you, wonderful. Last year, my convocation was based on a film that I had made from some of my research last year, entitled The Vanishing Point, Tracing Shadows in Prussian Blue. And if any of you would like to watch it, I would encourage you to do that. Here's a link to it right here. To scan it tonight, we're not going to be able to watch that film today because it's 20 minutes long. It's something I would encourage you to do and kind of give you a little bit of I will give a little bit of a brief summary of what this film is about and of what the focus was here so that I can then get into the subject of what I'm going to be talking about today, which is kind of dealing much more with a trip that I just took over this past at the end of the spring semester. So, at the heart of the project that I did was my own personal relationship with my grandfather, who was a survivor of Auschwitz-Birkeanu himself, as well as a survivor of Dora Mittelbau, and then kind of consequently Ravensbrück and things like that. He was not Jewish. He was a Polish political prisoner. He, as a teenager, joined the Polish resistance. I'll talk a little bit more about this, but he was captured and was sent to the concentration camp system after he was found guilty for sabotage work that he was doing. He met my grandmother in a Polish displacement camp in England. Immediately after the war, they married, kind of rushed, got married. And after 2 years and 2 kids, and lots of stress on both sides of the marriage, the marriage dissolved. And my grandfather sort of just vanished. We didn't really know too much about him. My father had no memories of his father growing up. And as a child in the 50s, 60s, he didn't really care. He was just sort of into his sports and into his schooling and things like that. And it wasn't until the late 1980s he discovered that there was a little bit of interest in knowing who his father was, primarily because of the very odd last name that we have. It's extremely rare. The Dojs name has its highest population in the Western Hemisphere here in Bismarck, North Dakota. It's my house. But even over in Europe and in Poland, where Poland has the highest concentration of Dojses, even there it's just a little over 100 of Dojses. So it was one that, as a child, I was always really drawn to. I was really interested in knowing more about where I came from. And I was fascinated by the fact that I wanted to know my origin story of especially the family. It just so happened that person I was looking for information about, his first name was Adam. And so the only 2 things I knew about my grandfather growing up as a child was his name was Adam, and that during the war he was in Auschwitz. And this got me started in a lot of the research that you will hear today, and that's kind of propelled me in my life and Holocaust and genocide studies. But in 1989, my father met his father for the first time, when my father turned 40. And met him, and then a number of years later, I got to meet him for the first time as well. And there he is right here. This is actually my grandfather's family. We got to meet him. I got to meet him in 1998 and immediately began to build a relationship with him. My grandfather is this one right here on the side, the one with the ears, which is important to kind of for the vanishing point as well. This is my father, my grandfather, and myself actually on our first meeting, the first time that I got to meet him. I was a senior in college at this time period. I'd gone to England in particular to do some oral history research with my grandmother and her sisters, and it just so happened that during that trip I got to meet my grandfather for the first time. And what was wonderful about meeting him for the first time was beginning to get a lot of these kind of void spots in my life to begin to get filled. And I began to, get to see a little bit more. So it wasn't just a name and a place that was associated with him anymore. It became a lot more. There was a lot more story element. And I got to hear all about his experiences during the war. And it was interesting how often the stories that he would say, my mother would say, it's like he's a Polish James Bond or something. Or the Polish Casanova was the other one too. Like he's in these adventures and all women love him and things like this. And it's fascinating to say that and to think that, because a lot of the research that I've been doing, especially with this subject matter, we tend to frame stories, especially stories that are incomprehensible for us to really get out there. We frame them in frameworks that are familiar. And what becomes really popular in the 1960s and 70s? The James Bond movies. And so as a survivor of the war, having gone through all these different things, been in resistance, this was a way for him to put images and words to his experiences, which in many ways were limiting to trying to explain what it was that he went through. The work that I did during this time period was just trying to learn more about him and to hear his stories and to record and to verify things. I'm a big, as a historian, I want to hear the stories, but I also want to verify them, right? This is also a really good tool for journalists and for communicators, trying to get that information and verifying that information. And so over the next 15 years of my life, I got to know him in a greater way. I got to visit him numerous occasions and spend quite a bit of time with him. My 4 older children got to meet him as well before he passed away in 2013. Just so happened to pass away on my birthday in 2012, sorry. In November of 2012, he passed away. In fact, November 20th, 2012, and that date will pop up again in a couple of places. If you were in my convocation last year, you discovered that I was taking a course on Holocaust representation, how photographs have kind of been present in different places, and how in my own life I've utilized photographs to kind of fill in some of those void spaces and those negative spaces when I was trying to learn more about who my grandfather was and his story. And as I got to know more about him and those negative spaces began to be filled in, I began to look at a lot of the images that I had grown up with in different ways. And last year, studying the what is known as the Lily Jacob album, which is a series of about 200 photographs that were preserved and saved at the end of the Second World War, I came across this photograph right here in the center. And after having looked at it and having examined it, I came to the conclusion that one of the figures in it was my grandfather. I have no way of actually verifying this because my grandfather is no longer with us. But as I was recently explaining to my father, I have a feeling, I said, you know what he would say, right? And to my dad, he goes, well, no, what would he say? He would say in his accent, of course, that's me. Yes, that's me. And he would then start naming all the people standing around him because the stories that he would end up saying seemed incredulous. It was like incredible. It was just like, really? What? And to the point of where it only seemed like it was a James Bond movie. One of the things that Yad Vashem, which is the museum, the archives of that preserve the Holocaust memory in Jerusalem, said the more incredible the stories are, the more true they tend to end up being. All right? And so these were the things that I had learned from my grandfather and so forth. And so the film that I ended up building was about this photograph and a series of photographs that kind of build into this. So I encourage you to look deeper into those and explore those, that film a little bit more. I also created a cyanotype utilizing the color Prussian Blue, which has some intimate connections with the Holocaust as well. See my film for more details on that information. But this past summer, I got to go to these places that I had only read about for many years. And as a part of my research, I'm really fascinated with places, spaces, and voids. As somebody who loves that history, I grew up around hearing these people going to places and immediately sort of imagining the history that was in those places. And this past spring, I got to go to this place for the first time. How many of you, just by show of hands, have been to Auschwitz-Birkeanu before? Right, a few of you have. This was a place, it was very interesting for me to walk in this place for the first time because I felt like I had been there numerous times because I had been so exposed to the visuals of this place. Having grown up looking at these images and things like that, I know these places, and I'll kind of get into this a little bit more. But this image right here, having seen that last image of the prisoners standing there, of everyone, I'm actually standing in the exact location where the figure is that my grandfather, who I believe is my grandfather, at the in the previous picture. If he turned and looked to the right, this is what he would have seen. This is the exact location for that. Being able to study history and these events and pulling photographic evidence, pulling oral testimony, and then actually being at these different places give us different understandings of this information. Right? We can read about something, but being in a place that what's being described is a very different experience. We can, be at a place, but hearing testimony straight from the mouths of survivors is a very different and different understanding of things. And I believe if we can pull these things together, we can have a greater understanding of what is actually happening in these different places, in these different images and things like that. What's fascinating about these images, and in fact the Lily Jacob album, is that the first real serious historical examination of these photographs just took place a couple of years ago, like 2021. These photos have been around since 1944 and have been in the hands of people who are going to preserve them since the end of the war. And it's interesting how now we just begin to do real serious historical examination on them. And so I wanted to spend a little bit of time kind of looking at things, looking at these photographs in a personal way, and having been to these different places, placing, kind of removing some of these. When we look at photographs, we tend to just see that as just a two-dimensional object instead of a moment in time that has been captured. And so I wanted to take a little bit of time and look particularly at these particular prisoners that you see in these photographs. These were known as the Ramp Commando. Commando is the German word for essentially work group, and the Ramp Commando were those who were assigned to work on the ramp, and the ramp was the long railway track entrance to Auschwitz-Birkeanu, which was built specifically for the arrival of these prisoners that you see in these photographs. These prisoners were part of over 500,000 Hungarian Jews who were being deported and processed, as Eichmann would put it, in between May of 1944 and August of 1945. An incredibly tense period with a lot of work that was going on there, and a lot of pressures being placed on these prisoners in particular. Now, what's fascinating is the current historical research on these prisoners do not take into account a major feature. You'll notice the prisoners that are here on the left, these ramp commando prisoners, the way that they are dressed, they have striped uniforms on, and they have striped caps on. But you'll notice the prisoners on the far right here, they're distinguished differently. They have a black cap on. They have an armband on as well. In fact, all members of this group have an armband on. When I was doing research into this, I contacted one of the authors of the primary study of this, and I'd asked if they had discovered any information about this. They said that they had not discovered any information about it. And yet, these photographs contain an image of what seems to be about 9 separate prisoners who are all off to the side. And you'll notice them in these different images. They tend to be the only ones that are aware of the camera's presence, right? Especially here in this middle image, you notice a number of them looking up at the camera, looking up at the image that's there. We can also trace the movements of these prisoners. So these are these particular prisoners throughout 3 of the main pictures in the Lily Jacob album. And they're in lots of different places. So the figure who I think is my grandfather, right here, in these 2 locations. In fact, this image right here was taken just moments after the image on the bottom is taken, because you can see the prisoners that he's standing with are the exact prisoners, right? So the next one's here, this fellow, right there. And then perhaps the easiest one to identify, the tall guy who's wearing his hat just kind of askewed. We have these 2 fellows here who seem like they were sent to go do something together, and they stand together as well on the ramp. We have this 3rd character who's just cropped out of this image right here, but standing with this group, still standing with the same group, that this group of prisoners have been assigned to do something, and it's not help the prisoners who are coming off of the trains. We have this one right here, who only appears in 2 images, and I associate these 2 together because in this first one, he's carrying a bag. It looks like he is actually helping do something. And in this image, in the main image, this is the only prisoner who's coming back who doesn't have anything in his hands, and it's because he's been doing work. And then we have 2 additional prisoners who appear in the image that they are not in these other ones right here. And they're all grouped together. They all have a guard. You see the guard that's here in this image? There is a guard that's overseeing that group of prisoners specifically. And then the image for this one right here, there's a guard that's just off to the side as well. These images right here that are being caught are a part of a series, right? So if we were to look at these series of images, this is the first one, right? The picture is taken here. Pay attention to where that X is. This is a setup of the series of images that are being planned, right? You can see that the photographer has a particular composition in mind. We would call this the utilization of linear perspective, that everything is going to a vanishing point right in the center of the screen. And if you look at that vanishing point, that's where all the people are going. That's where the trains converge together. It's also the point that exists between the smokestack of Crematorium 2 and the smokestack of Crematorium 3. This photographer, who's clearly trained as a photographer, understands art and understands linear perspective and understands the vanishing point so well that he is purposely framing his images to make it seem like the Jews in the image are not just metaphorically vanishing, but literally vanishing as well. They are heading towards their deaths. This image, I believe, is a setup. It's a setup. This is the image where we're going to be getting here, and the plan. Why is that? Because there's a lot more German soldiers and SS in this image than there are in others. So he takes this image. We see the belongings of the prisoners who've just come off the train on the left. The train that's on the right here is jam-packed with people. Jam-packed with people. Everyone that you're about to see on the ramp is from this next train. This is image number 1. Image number 2 is taken in the same location, but the photographer's composition is it's slightly skewed a bit, right? We suddenly have a truck that's in the middle of the runway here. We've got people coming out. He's trying to balance some things out. You can even see the image itself is not balanced properly. And after taking this image, he decides to move up a little bit closer to recompose the image. This image right here I'd seen as a young man doing research. I remember seeing this in a Holocaust museum, blown up on a wall. And I was always drawn to the figure in the bottom left-hand corner. And I was like, ooh, that looks very much like my grandfather. But that image is overexposed. The face is overexposed, slightly out of focus. And so for me, it was sort of like there's a visual representation of my grandfather's experience, but it's not him. Right? It was something that kind of personalized the image for me a little bit more. The photographer, after taking this image, decides to move to where the X is. And before he takes his final picture, turns and takes a picture of what's happening on the ramp right in front of him for some particular reason. Actually framing, very interestingly, the entire group that's working with them. We see 2 prisoners that are aware of the camera's presence. One of them, right here in the center, top center, he's looking right up at the cameraman. And then we have the figure who I believe is my grandfather, who is casting his eyes down as a way of not being seen, not being captured in a photograph. After taking this image, the photographer takes his most famous image. This one right here is the most well-known of this grouping of prisoners having left the ramp, or coming onto the ramp as well. You can also see clearly the chimneys of smokestack 2 and 3 of the crematoriums. Much clearer, much more in focus. We know that this was a propaganda piece. The entire Lily Jacob album is propaganda. And the major piece of propaganda here that's in this picture is, where are the guards? Where are the dogs? When we read about Auschwitz and when we read about, arrival, there's all of these comments about, people, violent guards and dogs and things like that. We don't see any of those things here in these images. These images show a group of compliant prisoners who are coming off of the train, and they're doing what they're told, and they're all moving towards the vanishing point. They're all moving towards their deaths. And the photographer takes the pictures, and the entire series of pictures in the album, nearly 200, show compliance completely. Which is why I think this group of prisoners are actually in these pictures. My grandfather, in his testimony, told me that while he was in Auschwitz, was placed in the political department of Auschwitz. The political department in Birkenau. The political department was the department that dealt specifically with kind of all of the the politics in the camp, the workings of the camp. The Gestapo ran out of the political department. The photographer's office ran out of the political department. All incoming prisoners who were actually processed through, given numbers, head shaves, and actual showers, all went through the political department. My grandfather's testimony includes stories of shaving prisoners and working in those particular areas. Having the photographer come from the political department, my theory is that to create the illusion of kind of the ease of what's going on here was to bring these prisoners in, to give them brooms. Those of you who've stood on the ramp itself, it's not a smooth, you know, if you think about what you're sweeping on that ramp. It's a dirt floor, right? There's no need for you to be sweeping anything there. And yet they're all given brooms and almost told, like, you pay attention to the photographer, you move where the photographer needs you. And if any prisoners start coming towards you or try to get over the tracks, you put your broom up and you stop them. And I can imagine that just off to the side here, and we see a group of people standing there on the extreme edge. I'm sure there's a number of soldiers with guns ready to go if necessary. But this is a theory that we can kind of look at and kind of prescribe, and through oral testimony have some kind of clear understanding of the situation. In my discussion, I kind of wanted to get back into some of the linear perspective elements. Linear perspective was something that was developed in the Renaissance period. If you wanted to talk about depth in art, for example, you simply put things on top of other things. So if you look at this image here of these people, they're all exactly the same size, but you know that the ones in the back are further away because, well, these others are in front of it. The illusion of depth becomes a thing in the Renaissance period through paintings like this and through the use of the linear perspective, and in particular what becomes known as that vanishing point and the line on the horizon. If we think too about churches, especially Catholic churches, this is how we're built, right? Everything leads to the center area, which is the tabernacle, right? Where the point of eternity meets. Everything meets in this one particular place. But without that truth, and in the hands of others, it can lead into just nothingness, into emptiness. And this is what our photographer is utilizing in these images as he creates the linear perspective there. Here's another example of linear perspective being used in a couple of areas. There's one large that's happening in the center, but then we have linear perspective used in different areas within the image to draw your attention to different things and to speak about deeper truths about the eternal elements. And of course, this is perhaps the most famous image utilizing linear perspective, where all eyes lead us to the eternal in the center of the image. So one of the things that I wanted to do this summer when I went on my trip, I wanted to go to these places. I wanted to go to Auschwitz in particular. I had been to Dora Mittelbau before. I went in 2013 to fulfill one of my grandfather's wishes, final wishes that he wanted to have done. But I had always delayed going to Auschwitz because I wanted to really be prepared for that, and I wanted to be really prepared for it. And so I went to a number of places before I went to Auschwitz, and to kind of help us understand this, I wanted to show you a little bit of a map and explain some things. This is what Poland looked like in 1930, and this is what Poland essentially looked like at the beginning of the war. Kind of encompassing where all of the events of things that took place and where my family were. My grandmother's family were from the east, and where it says Novogrodek, that's where my grandmother's family is from. Today, this is all in Belarus. The further areas in the south are in Ukraine. And the elements on the west have been adopted into Poland. The area where my grandfather's family were from the Poznan region, in particular kind of in between these areas. And my great-grandfather, he was a World War I veteran, was a station master. He learned how to do his trade on the rails. And he brought his family with him, and he would then kind of move around to different places. And when the war began, he was assigned to be the station master of Kutno railway station. And at this time, in 1939, Kutno was one of the major junctions coming into Poland. So if you were coming into Poland from the west, you came to Kutno, and that was where you went south. That was where you went, continuing going to the west. That's where you went north. It was a major, major area. And so my grandfather grew up around trains, around that type of service. And when the war began, and the schools were closed, the family was relocated, as were most Poles who were from the Poznan region, into what became known as the General Government of Poland, which was this center area of Poland, right here. The areas in the east were all taken over by the Soviet Union. The areas in the west that were not a part of the general government were brought into the Third Reich, became areas where German settlers were invited to come into. And the rest were where the Poles were sent to, and also where all evacuating Jews were sent from around Europe. They were sent to the general government. All the extermination camps that we know of in the Holocaust were placed in the general government. The area where my family were sent was just outside of the Częstochowa region, and in particular in a small place called Kłomnic. It was a small station just north of Częstochowa. And Częstochowa is perhaps most famous for a particular place, which I'll talk about in just a second. My grandfather joined an underground school at this time period. He was only 15, 16. He was too young to be conscripted into the army. What the Germans did was when they would come into a place, if they were of age, they would take those people who were of age and put them in the German army, and in particular put them in the front lines. So I have an uncle who married into the family who also was from the West, who was sent to Stalingrad. He was on the front lines of Stalingrad. This was a very common thing. In fact, most of the people that he fought with in Stalingrad, he says they were Poles and Czechs and even the Romanians that were in that group. There were no Germans in that front line. It was all these foreign soldiers. So my grandfather was too young to be pulled into that, and so he was just basically sent to live with his family, and in the station, until he was approached by some members of the Polish Underground. The Polish Underground was a massive organization that, in fact, it was the largest resistance organization in World War II that was operated by the Polish government in exile based in London. And it was massive. It had its underground army, but it had an underground court system. It had underground education efforts. It had underground support systems for people who were starving in different places. It was massive. And he was approached by some members because he had access to the rails. And as the child of the station master, he was well known by other stations around. He was inconspicuous to the police that were often on the rails. And so he was approached to be a courier. And he gladly did it. He was happy to do so, but he then became more involved in underground activity, moving into actually assassinations and killings. And on November 20th, 1943, which that date comes up again, he was captured and he was sent to prison in Częstochowa. Częstochowa, which is most famously known for this place, right? This is Jasna Góra, the Bright Mountain, which is the place where the image of Our Lady of Częstochowa sits. Even if you don't know the name, you probably are familiar with the image itself. As a child, being a Pole, there were two images that were required in our household. In fact, I still think this is the case. You have to have an image of Our Lady of Częstochowa in your house, and you have to have an image of Pope John Paul II pretty close by. And it's a very important thing. And so as a child, I always wanted to go to Częstochowa. And on my trip, I got to go, as did a bunch of motorcyclists. I didn't realize, but it was the national pilgrimage day for the like a motorcycle mass. This was the beginning of them arriving. I walked around the walls, and as I was noticing all these people showing up, I decided I needed to get into the shrine a little bit quicker. This is the shrine of Our Lady of Częstochowa itself. A place of healing, a place of miracle, a really important place for the Poles. And this is the shrine itself. It's very interesting. The stole that you see here on the left, that's the stole that John Paul II was wearing when he was the attempted assassination that took place in the 1980s. And there is his blood that's on it. He gave the glory. He gave the glory he blamed Our Lady for saving his life. So he wanted to give this there. And all of these other elements in here, these are all elements that have been given to the shrine in honor of Our Lady. And so I wanted to go there. I wanted to see that the motorcycles start coming in a lot more. And at one point, too, as I was leaving, I had to wait 20 minutes to cross the street because of the parade of motorcycles that were coming in. And here is a closer image of Our Lady of Częstochowa. So it's an image that you've probably seen before, but one that is greatly important for the Poles. I was really, really blessed to be there at the end of April and the beginning of May. May, of course, is Mary's month. And in Poland, it seems like every other day in May is a day to honor Our Lady. And so I was there in the midst of all of this. It was wonderful to be there. But one of the other primary reasons I wanted to be in Częstochowa was I wanted to go to the prison where my grandfather was sent. This is the rail station. That should have actually appeared a little bit earlier. Come on, let's get this piece of video up here. I did show video, play video. We'll leave that and see if it comes up in just a second. But in Częstochowa itself, there's a large town square with the government elements on one side and then other chapels and churches all over the place. And still standing to this day is the building where the Gestapo prison was. Here we go. Look at that. Perfect timing. You can hear the preaching from the mass that for the motorcycles are being pumped into the area. And this wonderful church right here, but just behind here, just to show you how close it is, that's Gestapo prison. A building that has been repurposed and is a block of flats. I don't know who would want to live there, but that is where on November 20th, 1943, my grandfather was sent, and these persecutions that he experienced began to experience. Began. He was in the prison here for a month, and he said very little about what he experienced there, but if it's anything like any other Gestapo prison experience, he most likely experienced vast amounts of torture to try to get names and information from others to get that information about people that he was working with in the underground. And after that, I went to Auschwitz, which is the exact place where he ended up going. The first day I arrived in Auschwitz, I went and I had a meeting in the archives. All of you have seen the archive building, actually. It's this building right here. It's the building on the side. In fact, the head archivist's office is the corner window right there. And on my first day in Auschwitz, I went there and wanted to see in particular a couple of documents that verify my grandfather's experience there in Auschwitz-Birkeanu. That not only do we have the information about what he did when he came into the place, he actually, as a 17-year-old, he told everyone that he was a locksmith, which is not what he was. But if he's being sent to prison and you're trying to get out, that's not a bad profession to put down, because I might get some tools that I can actually use to get out of this place. And I in particular wanted to see this document right here. This document right here is known as the Strauf Company book. The Strauf Company book is one of the few documents that exist that were saved from Auschwitz that chronicle the deaths of prisoners. I'll play the video here. When Auschwitz was, when the Germans knew that they were going to have to abandon Auschwitz, they did everything they could to destroy as much evidence as they could. If you've been to Birkenau, the major gas chambers that were utilized, 2, 3, and 4, were all destroyed by the Germans, and crematorium 5 was destroyed actually by prisoners of the Sonderkommando who tried to have a revolt in August of 1944, and they destroyed the crematorium itself. But they destroyed tons and tons of documents, tons and tons of photographs that were also taken to record the fate of these prisoners. When the Soviet troops came to Auschwitz, they found a mess. And in particular, they kind of came into some areas and they would find papers all over the place. And after sifting through lots and lots of papers, they began to identify pieces of record. This document in particular is the Strauf Company book. You can see the damage that's been done to this book. The binding coming across, ink having been spilled on it. The front section of the book, pages had been ripped out of it completely. And there were actually still, and I didn't get a photograph of this, on the front of the cover that was there. Got a volume down here. On the front cover were still dirt footprints of the soldiers who had come in and found this. And but this document right here actually records the names of prisoners who were sent to the Strauf Company. Strauf Company was the prison inside the prison of Auschwitz. It was where the worst work outside of the Sonderkommando was placed. The Sonderkommando were the Jews who had to work in the crematoriums. The Strauf Company were usually given the heavy lifting work. But look at the date when my grandfather was placed in the Strauf Company. It's the 28th of June, 1944. That is that's during the height of the Hungarian action, as it became known. And every available worker was placed to work there in those different places. The things that my grandfather said that he had to do included shoveling ash, and it seemed also that he was very, very familiar with what was happening inside the crematoriums. So the things that he experienced in his time period in the Strauf Company were horrendous and clearly had massive amounts of psychological impact on him. This was a document I wanted to see, but I had a great surprise when I was there because the archivist discovered another document that I had never seen before. This document was a work document. It's a daily work report. And it says right up on the top here, it was the Commando 129, and that day they were digging irrigation ditches, which those of you who've been to Birkenau, the river's not too far away, and if it rains, the area floods. And this is the list of all the people who worked that day. Not just their names and their numbers, their race, how much they were paid, because they were, for the work that they were given. You know, they were told, you're doing some work, you will get paid in Reichsmark and so forth. But this document shows the systematic racial system of the Third Reich. Kind of point these things out to you really quickly. On the left column, we have the prisoners' numbers. We have the names in the center. We have their race and nationality in the next column, and we have how much they were paid in the second to last column, and then their signature in their final column. If you notice that first name right there, 2 Reichsmark. That name is the name of the capo, the person who was in charge of the workforce. Also, the race of that person is RD. That's Reichsdeutsch. This was a German national, most probably a criminal or a communist who were seen as they should be sent to the concentration camps. Everybody else is given less than that. 0.89, 0.89. This is for all the P's were the 0.89. Z's were the Czechs. And R's were Russians, things like that. On this list, very interestingly, there's someone from Greece that's there. And continuing down more and more. What's fascinating, when I was looking at this document with the archivist, I said, it looks like my grandfather might not have been paid for the day. And it also looks like maybe it was sort of a squeeze in there. That is his signature that's there on the side. His 18-year-old signature on the side there. Fascinating stuff. And the thing that I find absolutely fascinating about this document is that it had become so humdrum at this time that they didn't even put the date on the daily work report. It was a sort of, they'd done it so many times, they just simply said, well, here's what everyone's paid. They didn't even get concerned about putting the date down. So it shows that this is stuff that had been going on and they had been engaged with for time and time and time again. My own tour of Auschwitz was very somber, obviously, kind of going through these places that I had been to in my studies, but also in my imagination numerous times. But then also seeing the displays and things like that, especially this one right here, having a very different impact for me as I go through these times. In fact, going into Birkenau, there is or Auschwitz-Birkeanu, there is a video that introduces you to the place. And one of the primary photographs that they use to introduce you to the place is the photograph that I did my study on. And the character of the person who I think is my grandfather is one of the main people that they focus themselves around. Research-wise, Yad Vashem is doing everything they can to try to find names of people because they want to give names to these victims. They want to give names back to these people instead of just having them groups of, well, these are the victims. They want to give them names. That figure, no one can name. No one names that person. I'm the only person that's actually named that person. And once again, I can never really verify these things. Right? But the visible evidence of these atrocities are a big thing. We can read all about this stuff, and we can see photographs of them, but when we see them in person and we stand in these locations, it has a much different impact. It has a much different impact. And for a lot of people, too, who went to these places, they never came back. They never came back. And so for us today to be able to go to a place that was the vanishing point for so many, many people, we have a responsibility to go and to come back and to share and to make sure we never forget. So, thank you very much for your time.